Today I'm going to talk about a topic that might be difficult to hear, but it is important for people to know. And I have collected information and put them all into a document carefully written. Because this topic is quite complex and serious, I wanted to be prepared, and what I'm going to read off now is a condensed version of that document. So, how is China using DNA to erase Tibetan people? We live in an age where the boundaries between science and politics, technology and oppression are no longer clear. This is a time where the double helix of DNA, once a symbol of life and discovery, is being weaponized by authoritarian powers like the CCP. In Tibet, a land of sacred mountains, monasteries and deep cultural memory, something horrific is taking place. This is not only a story of language bans, forced assimilation, and cultural erasure. It is a story of molecular colonization. I will elaborate on that a bit later. It is the story of how the Chinese state is harvesting the DNA of Tibetan children and using it to map, monitor, and manipulate an entire population into silence and disappearance. Cultural genocide in the digital age. China has taken over 1 million Tibetan children from their homes. They are placed in state-run schools where Tibetan language, religion, and culture are forbidden. They are isolated from their families, return only on weekends. If parents resist, children are banned from entering first grade. This is the state's way of severing cultural memory. But the erasure doesn't stop at language and religion, it goes deeper, it goes into the cells. Now, the reasoning behind why the CCP took those 1 million kids is because kids are at a stage where they are the most influenceable. Normally, parents take care of them and guide them during those vulnerable stages of development in a human being. But if those kids are not under the protection of their parents, and here it's about the Tibetan parents, the CCP can tell them whatever they want to and brainwash them into whatever they want them to think. Now, Tibetan parents will make sure that the child knows that they're Tibetan and that they are not part of China. This goes against the regime's mindset because they are broadcasting that Tibet has always been part of China, which is a lie and is not the case. And they don't want the upcoming future generation of Tibetan children to be as rebellious as the last one. So what they do is they brainwash them. So in future, they have obedient Tibetan citizens who don't question the regime because they've been brainwashed and who follow the rules. This is another way of dictatorship oppressing a population, is by securing the future, by making sure the future generations will be more obedient. And a second reason for why they do this is there have been cases where one has found out that they extract DNA from those kids and also from Tibetan adults. And we will come to that point later. So China has taken over 1 million Tibetan children from their homes. And when it comes to DNA extraction, what does DNA reveal? DNA is not just a biological code, it is a record of identity. It contains SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms. Those are the variations in genetic sequence between population, species, and individual family members, for example. These markers can tell scientists who you're related to, what population you belong to, and even which geographic region your ancestors come from. They can tell that all from single nucleotide polymorphisms. Autosomal DNA reveals close family. Mitochondrial DNA reveals maternal lineage. Y DNA reveals paternal lineage. Together, these tools can reconstruct entire family trees, meaning it is easy to find out the identity of a Tibetan person or to find out who the relatives are. So what are the consequences? Family tracing and genetic surveillance. Even without surnames, as in Tibetan tradition, DNA allows the state to trace individuals and their relatives by collecting DNA from children. China can identify the parents, siblings, cousins, and even distant ancestors. Tibetan exiles abroad can be linked back to families still living in Tibet. This enables a new kind of threat. Stop protesting or your relatives will suffer. This is genetic blackmail. Now, they have been blackmailing Tibetans in exile to stay quiet by telling them that they will harm their family members. This has already been happening, so that's not something new. But now, on top of that, there's this genetic aspect to it, where it's very easy for the CCP to find out who your relatives are. You can't really keep it a secret anymore. Your identity, your heritage, what family you come from, which region you come from. All those things are open now for the CCP, and they will use this to the benefit to do better and stronger blackmailing. Weaponizing DNA collection. The regime says DNA is collected for crime prevention. But how can a 6-year-old commit a crime? Now, this is a rhetorical question, obviously, but I am asking that to underline that this is just an excuse. This justification falls apart under scrutiny. DNA is not being used to solve crimes. It's being used to build a total surveillance system, one that starts before a person can even speak. By profiling genetics, China is labeling Tibetans as threats before they have done anything at all. Now, crime prevention. Like I said, how can a 6-year-old commit a crime? This kind of genetic profiling and weaponization of DNA collection is going to be an excuse for them to put Tibetan people who have not even done anything, young Tibetan people who have not even done anything, who haven't even shown any type of resistance towards the regime. They will use it as reasoning to put them under surveillance or in prison already, just because they come from a heritage of rebellion. Genetic assimilation and crossbreeding. Tibetans have unique traits like EPAS1 gene, which allows Tibetans to live and sustain at that high altitude, because Tibet is such a high altitude that the oxygen levels are quite low up there. This gene and others make Tibetan physiologically different. There's a growing concern that China is analyzing these traits, not just to control Tibetans, but to extract these advantages and introduce them into the Han population. This is not science for medicine, it is eugenics. It is a strategy to genetically erase the distinctiveness of the Tibetan people. Now, it is already known that one strategy of the CCP to minimize Tibetan population is by honey plotting, making Chinese women seduce Tibetan male so they interbreed with each other, and that's how they want the Tibetan population slowly to decline and to interfuse Chinese with Tibetan genes. This has been happening for years now. But on top of that, there is a high chance that they are using science in order to extract genetic benefits for themselves. Because Tibetan soldiers, they are fine up there, right? In the mountains. They can survive. Chinese soldiers have been complaining that it is too difficult to fight up there in the mountains. They're struggling with oxygen levels, and that is another reason why the CCP is trying to extract that particular gene. And another reason is they want to take this advantage away from Tibetan people. So at some point, the distinctiveness between Tibetan and Chinese people will disappear, the differences. Now, oogenesis and surveillance of the unborn. Oogenesis is the process through which eggs form inside a female fetus. And by the time a Tibetan girl is born, her eggs already carry the DNA of her future children. This means that when the state collects her DNA, it is not just collecting data on her, it is collecting data on generations yet to be born. This is not surveillance, it is preemptive biological control, which goes against every human right, like, terrible. Organ harvesting and biomedical exploitation. China has been credibly accused of forcibly harvesting organs from Uyghurs detainees. DNA collection makes this even more terrifying. With a full genetic database, the state can identify Tibetans with ideal organ matches, rare blood types, or healthy genetics and target them. This is not speculation, this is bio-exploitation. Now, for example, by knowing the DNA of a person, they might find out, okay, that Tibetan person has a really good functioning lung. And that will target that Tibetan, that will make that Tibetan person a target for the CCP. So it's a very dangerous thing in the wrong hands. And they are collecting DNA. And now if you think about it, a dictatorship who oppresses other cultures, from which population do you think will they choose to organ harvest? From the populations they oppress, not from their own population. Predictive policing and the future of total control. China is already using AI to predict dissent. Combine that with DNA data and you can predict who might resist based on the ancestry, their family's past, or even their physiology. Children of known protesters can be flagged before they ever speak. Identity becomes criminalized, and DNA becomes the proof of guilt. Now, this predictive policing and future of total control, that means that a Tibetan kid could be born, and due to his identity, his whole life, how he gets treated, where he ends up being in prison or under surveillance, depends all on his identity of an innocent Tibetan child. Predictive policing and the future of total control. That is going to cause issues in the future. Genetic apartheid and biocolonialism. This system allows the state to rank its citizen by blood. Full Tibetans may be labeled disloyal, mixed individuals rewarded for assimilation. This is not multiculturalism, this is apartheid, genetic apartheid. It is also colonialism, not of land but of genes. China is building a future in which Tibetan identity will not be banned. It will be rewritten at the molecular level. Now that is what I meant with cells, and that the history will be rewritten on a molecular level. It's not just about spiritual, emotional, and physical oppression. It is also about genetic oppression. Now, the only thing a Tibetan has is its Tibetan identity, right? Because we are oppressed in Tibet, and that is how we can identify ourselves as Tibetan, right? Apart from having a Tibetan heart. And that is what they are trying to erase. And they have been, like I said, broadcasting that Tibet is not part, that Tibet is part of China, and that it always has been, which is not the case. And Tibet has been also erased out of a lot of geographic landscapes. And now the last thing the Chinese CCP wants to do is make sure that on a genetic level we're also erased. So DNA should never be a weapon, yet in Tibet it is being used as one. In every Tibetan's child blood there is a story, a lineage of monks, warriors, poets and mothers. China's regime wants to erase that story before it can be told. But we must remember it, we must speak it, and we must resist, because this is not just Tibet's fight, it is the fight for human dignity itself. Now, Tibet has no future if it stays unified with China. The people in Tibet are suffering way more than we could possibly ever imagine, because China is one of the countries which shows the least. Their curtains are closed to the world. Even if you go on Google Maps, there are only a few places you can look at, you know. There's this feature where you can put area or a city, and then you get pictures and you see the surrounding. For China, you can go try that. There's only a few places where they allow you to look into. Now, that is very suspicious, right? I mean, it is a dictatorship and it is known that they are doing things which shouldn't be done. But they have such huge surveillance principles that I believe that there are really bad things happening there. And there have been examples of Tibetan women who were in prison, who have been tortured by electrical gadgets pushed up into the intimate area down there. And Tibetan people landing in prison for speaking up about wanting a free Tibet. For decades they have been in a prison. People who chew on their leather shoes because they don't get any food in prison. And a lot of videos which you see from Tibet inside, from Tibetan people, a lot of that is monitored in a way. You're allowed to show that if you look happy, if you look like you're not being oppressed, because it helps the reputation of the CCP. But what really is happening there, that the people there are under constant pressure of falling victim to the CCP because they do or say something wrong, is immense. And them taking 1 million kids into those boarding schools shows how far they are willing to go to erase us Tibetans. And them taking the DNA and the Chinese president saying this is for crime prevention. First of all, I wouldn't believe any dictator what they say, right? Secondly, for crime prevention from kids? You want to prevent a small kid from doing a crime? How is a small kid going to do a crime? That is, like I said, just an excuse. The real reasons behind those things are genetic profiling, genetic surveillance, genetic mapping and monitoring. All kind of new strategies to total oppression. Now, for those, there are some Tibetan, right, who still believe it is a good choice to stay with China, and who think that the Chinese will treat us good, or that we are being treated good, because there are some Tibetans who live in exile and who support that and who say yes, it's a good thing, you know. First of all, you guys live in the exile. How would you know if it's a good thing or not? Like, what the world gets shown about what happens in Tibet is not reality. It's just an illusion. And secondly, why would you, if you think it's good, then why don't you go back? Because saying it is good and choosing something else is questionable. And to those people, some of those Tibetan people, they get paid to support the Chinese, to help in the exile, to manipulate other Tibetans in the exile government, you know, to make sure that not just inside of Tibet, Tibetans are oppressed, but they also want to make sure that outside of Tibet, that the Tibetan exile government will be how they want it to be. Now, I would really question if Umelam is a good thing. I mean, after hearing all of that, can you still support Umelam? Does it feel right to support Umelam, knowing that those things happen? For me, it definitely doesn't, and I believe the only way to, as a Tibetan, to live happily and without an oppression and live out our culture and identity is without the Chinese oppression. And I think to a lot of people, it would seem quite logical that with an oppression, life there is not bearable. Yeah. So this was what I wanted to talk about. I hope you guys understood everything, and I hope that this will be spread in case some people didn't know what happens and why the genes are being extracted, and I wish you a nice day. Bye.